All right, let's get started. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Kevin Corinth, and I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. I'm also the deputy director of AEI Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility. Today is an important day. We're here because 2 hours ago, the United States Census Bureau released what are arguably the most important data of the entire year. For the first time, we're able to determine whether American households were better off in 2023 than in the previous years. As a point of reference, it's worth reflecting on how much attention we dedicate to other data releases, like the monthly jobless claims and inflation numbers. These are no doubt invaluable indicators of the state of the economy, which should and do influence policy decisions. But at the end of the day, what we really care about is whether American households as a whole are becoming better or worse off over time. To answer that question, we need the numbers from the Census Bureau on household income and poverty. We can learn from the new data, for example, whether middle-class families are better off than they were a year ago and a decade ago, whether fewer Americans are suffering from poverty, whether inequality has worsened, and whether we've made progress in reducing earnings gaps across race, ethnicity, and gender. These questions and related ones are the ultimate test of our economic policies. They're also timely because in a few hours, Vice President Harris and former President Trump will take the stage at their first and possibly only presidential debate. It is notably their administrations that have shaped the economic policies over the past 8 years and thereby influenced the data we received this morning. From tax reform to regulatory changes to historic fiscal packages, federal policy has played an outsized role in affecting economic well-being of Americans over the past 8 years. Parsing out the effects of these policies can help inform the wisdom of future ones, not to mention their popularity among voters. Regardless of the political context, these are the questions that many of us at AEI focus on the most, as we seek to inform the policy debate with evidence on what policies do the most to help American families. It is for this reason that we embark today on our second annual AEI event discussing the new census data on income and poverty. At last year's inaugural event, we focused especially on the poverty numbers in light of the major changes to the child tax credit in the 2021 and 2022 calendar years that disproportionately increased resources at the bottom of the income distribution. This year, we take a broader view of households across the distribution and tie trends to major policy changes as proposed policy changes by leading presidential candidates. Before we get into the new numbers and a conversation about what they mean, I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists. We are fortunate to be joined by leading experts on data on economic well-being and their connection to policy. Vanessa Brown-Calder, immediately to my right and your left, is the Director of Opportunity and Family Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, where she focuses on policies that support families and increase opportunity. Previously, she was the Executive Director at the Joint Economic Committee, a policy analyst at the Cato Institute, and a graduate fellow in welfare studies at the Heritage Foundation. Her articles have appeared in numerous popular outlets, and her work is featured in radio and television programming and policy briefings on Capitol Hill. She holds a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School at Harvard University. Seated next, two down the line, you're not in order. Bradley Hardy is a distinguished professor in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a co-editor at Contemporary Economic Policy, and holds many other important positions. His research focuses on economic mobility, poverty, and the roles of race and place in determining economic and policy outcomes. He has published numerous articles in academic journals, testified before Congress, and provided commentary in popular outlets. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Kentucky. Next, we have Michael Strain, coming back one this way. He is the Director of Economic Policy Studies and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at AEI, as well as a professor of practice in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. His research focuses on labor markets, public finance, social policy, and macroeconomics. He has published dozens of articles in leading academic and policy journals and is the author of the book, The American Dream is Not Dead, But Populism Could Kill It. He has testified before Congress, is a frequent guest on radio and television shows, and frequently writes for popular audiences. He holds a PhD in economics from Cornell University. Finally, on the far end, we have Scott Winship, who is a senior fellow and the director of the Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility at AEI, where he researches social mobility and the causes and effects of poverty. He previously served as the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee, where he created the Social Capital Project. He was also previously a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, and served in other important positions. He has testified before Congress and has been published widely in the popular press. He holds a PhD in social policy from Harvard University. All right, I'll now take a few minutes to review the highlights of the data just reported by the Census Bureau just this morning. We'll then spend an hour or so dissecting what they mean among the panel, and then we'll reserve the final 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So as we go, please be thinking of your questions. All right, so I'll direct you to the slides on the big screens on either side of me. So these are the numbers that were just released at 10 o'clock a.m. this morning by the Census Bureau. I'm just going to provide a recap of some of the highlights. This will be a subset of what people are likely to talk about, but I just want to give you a sense of what the numbers were. So first of all, median household income increased by 4.0% in 2023 relative to 2022. This was the first increase in median income since 2019. In 2023, median household income was at $80,610. That is slightly below what it was in 2019. In addition, the Census Bureau released a post-tax measure of income. So this income measure does not adjust for taxes that people pay. When you look at post-tax income, that increased by about 3.7% since 2022, telling a similar story. There were also even larger gains in income at the bottom of the distribution. At the 10th percentile, incomes grew by almost 7%, and inequality actually fell because we saw incomes grow more at the bottom than at the middle or the top. Next on poverty, so more good news there. The official poverty rate fell by 0.4 percentage points in 2023. It declined to a level of 11.1%. That is still not quite as low as it was in 2019, but it does mark an important decrease. Finally, the supplemental poverty measure. So the official measure does not adjust for taxes. It also does not include in-kind transfers like food stamps or the SNAP program, housing assistance, or other non-medical in-kind transfers. The supplemental poverty measure does include those resources, although as I'm sure we'll get into later in the discussion, it also does a lot of complicated things to the poverty thresholds. The supplemental poverty measure thresholds are a weighted average of the past 5 years of spending by median households on sort of basic necessities, and is set differently for different housing types. As a result, it's pretty hard to determine whether changes in the supplemental poverty measure over time are driven by changes in thresholds or resources. Nonetheless, the supplemental poverty rate actually increased by 0.5 percentage point in 2023 and was at a level of 12.9%. Okay, so those are the highlights I wanted to cover. I do want to mention that we will not be focusing much on the health insurance numbers unless some of the panelists decide to bring that up, not because they're not important, but just because I think a lot of the focus in the popular discourse is more on the income and poverty side. I'll note that there was very little change in health insurance coverage. The share of the population with health insurance decreased by 0.1 percentage point, and it was not statistically significant. Okay, so with that, I'm going to join the panel, and we will get into some of their top-level takes and some policy-related commentary that they have on the numbers. All right, I think my microphone is still on. So first question is really general. Really, what is your sort of top-level take from the numbers? Is this sort of good news, bad news, or a mixed bag? And sort of, is there anything in particular that stands out? For this question, I'll just kind of go down the line, starting with Vanessa, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I believe that some of the other folks on the panel will dive into the income and poverty numbers a little bit more. Obviously, it seems like some of those numbers at first glance, positive news, so that's exciting. In addition to those, if we drill down on a couple of other sort of subcategories here, the first is female and male pay. I think that this warrants some conversation because this is actually one number that declined. The female to male pay ratio actually declined, and it's the first time that it's declined since 2003, so it's been a little while since it ticked down. This chart, I think, is really interesting because it actually shows how the female to male pay ratio has been increasing over time, and what that means, of course, is that the gender pay gap has closed over time, and it has closed really substantially. If you look at 1980 or the late 70s, the pay gap was 40% in 1980, and it was 16% last year, and it's a little bit more than that this year, 17%. I do think that probably that tick down is probably sort of a temporary blip. Obviously we don't know that for sure, but certainly the trend is that the gender pay gap is closing pretty steadily over time. But I do think that warrants mentioning. And what is that pay gap actually coming from? Well, men's pay actually rose at a higher rate than women's pay this past year. So I think it's worth noting that it's not that women's pay declined, but actually that men and women's pay both rose, and men's pay just rose faster. So that's sort of like one interesting finding, I think, among some of the other top line findings that you laid out. Another story here that may or may not get covered is actually regional income, what regional income looks like. If you look across the census's regional income categories, it's actually positive across all categories this year. So the change in median income is positive in all categories, and that is opposite to what it was last year. In 2022, regional income had declined in every category, and it had declined the most in the Midwest. And in fact, this year, it has increased the most in the Midwest, which I think is interesting, possibly from a presidential election standpoint. Obviously we're watching the Midwest closely, or political analysts maybe are watching the Midwest closely because of the swing states contained in the Midwest. So it's obviously nice to see that across regions, median income has risen, and the recovery continues across the U.S.
Great, thank you. Mike, do you want to take it next? What are the top level takes?
I'm happy to. I'm impressed that we're able to have these charts that are updated with the data, because they only came out minutes ago. So this is impressive to me. More evidence of progress on the part of society. My kind of high level take: incomes went up. Poverty arguably was flat. Maybe poverty declined a little bit. And I think that's what you want to see. And so this tells me that 2023 was a year of recovery and improvement. That recovery and improvement, I think, is a relative to 2022. Is a sign that the Fed's efforts to get inflation under control bore some fruit in 2023 relative to 2022, and that the economy that produced that inflation, continued to sustain a tight labor market where people were earning a good amount of money. And so maybe another way to think about it is those inflation fighting efforts didn't result in a deterioration in the labor market that dragged earnings and incomes down with them. I don't think that is a surprise to people who've been following the data, but this annual census report carries a lot of weight, I think, with the policy community and with policymakers, and so it's good to see that conclusion ratified. A second thought and this is very much in the spirit of Vanessa's analysis of the gender pay gap, is that I think longer term trends are encouraging, and there's a sense in which we had this very strange pandemic, and the 2023 data, really, to me, could end up being remembered as the year in which the pandemic and its after effects, were kind of put behind us, and some of those longer term trends are more prominent, and the pandemic, the kind of temporary pandemic disruption, is less prominent. So if you look at the data on inequality, for example, you see additional confirmation that inequality has stalled out, maybe declined, and that now has been true for well over a decade. And so if you are very concerned about inequality, good news, as measured by the 90-10 ratio, it went down in 2023 relative to 2022. Probably even better news, over the last 10 or 15 years, it hadn't really grown all that much, and that's when measured on a pre-tax basis, pre-tax and transfer basis. Similarly, the gender pay gap, if that's something that you're very concerned about, good news, progress on that continues. And similarly, I think, for the headline income and poverty series, incomes after adjusting for inflation continue to grow, and poverty continues to fall, or maybe more conservatively continues not to grow.
All right, thanks. Bradley, what are your top level takes?
Sure.
Good news and bad news.
I mean, so I think that, Vanessa, Mike, you all really did lead off really well. And, frankly, I think folks are going to be digesting the report over the next couple of days and weeks. But absolutely, we have pretty robust evidence of this income growth, and there's a lot to like there. I think that if you start to really zoom in on the data, you can really learn something when we have a discussion about the two different types of ways in which we characterize poverty in the U.S. And so, the official measure is today going to largely be hinging on a lot of income from labor market earnings. You'll have Social Security in there as well, and whatever exists from some cash transfers like TANF. But we think, and this is my interpretation, that largely that OPM is going to be very much reliant on labor income, whereas the supplemental measure, it's trying to take into account a lot of these expenses that households face, alongside the whole range of government supports that are contributing to lifting a lot of families above a poverty line. And so with that kind of as a background, you have this interesting kind of like crossing pattern where ultimately the official poverty measure falls to about 11%, and the supplemental measure rises to close to 13%. And so it's interesting. They're roughly half a percentage point changes in opposite directions. And so, well, what do you make of that? And so, in part, I think that what we're reflecting is that on the one hand, we have some evidence that, earnings growth has been strong in general. And at the same time, we've had some pulling back of government supports over the last couple of years. And this is affecting some groups more than others, okay? Now, interestingly enough, our nation's government support programs are targeted towards households with dependent kids. And we still see there that when you compare these two measures, that this supplemental poverty measure that's accounting for these supports, you get a 1.5 percentage point reduction or difference, lowered poverty rate for the kids. And so, in some respects, that tells us that the system's doing largely what it's designed to do, right? And you can have an argument about what you want the system to do, but it's operating in that way. Again, trying to digest this maybe like an hour ago, a couple of blocks over, and I'm seeing.
Charts were getting made.
Well, it was all happening. Exactly.
at the same time.
The production function well at work here. So it's an interesting thing because if you kind of drill in within this report and you start to look at some respondents in the CPS with less education, you take high school dropouts, for example. This is an interesting group where you can see that, again, there's this kind of like divergence in the pattern where on labor income, they look one way in the OPM, but there seems to be a bit of a struggle when we account for some of the expenses and costs that folks with less than a high school education face. And so again, it starts to paint a picture that some of those government supports, as we know, are just no longer hitting some of these types of workers, right? And so that's just, it's an interesting point. I think it underscores a point that both political parties, I believe, have been trying to make, which is that there are some serious working class struggles, and you might think about different ways to help that group, but there are some struggles there, and you can have two things at once. So you can have an overall trend increase that might mask some other things going on, and I guess I would just kind of land by saying that when we're looking across groups, in some respects you see, more or less some stasis in the results. Black poverty rates, whichever way you cut it, are just inside of 20% overall. And so, there, I think that, we're always monitoring this. I would say that there's this interesting gap between this official poverty measure and the supplemental for both Hispanic respondents and Asian respondents. And so, these are complex racial and ethnic categories. And so you can argue about how and in what ways the Census Bureau is doing these groupings. But nevertheless, it's sort of worth monitoring, I think, that this supplemental poverty does look higher for both Asian and Hispanic respondents, statistically significantly so. And, it's hard to make sense of maybe what the precise right way of doing it is, but we know there's been price pressure on households, and certainly I think we're seeing some of that show up in the supplemental. So yeah.
Thanks, Scott. Good news or bad news, and any key takes?
Yeah, I think mostly. Oh, it was loud. I think mostly good news. Although I think the thing that I want to focus on is this question of what the hell is going on with the poverty rate the last 5 years. So I have a chart also, which hopefully will not be too overwhelming. Okay. All right. So a few things in this chart. The dashed line is 2019. So these are a bunch of different measures of poverty over the last 10 years. So I think the first thing to take away is through 2019, they're all telling the same story. Poverty going down, pretty unambiguous. Things start to get a little bit weird in 2020, in 2021, but I think we still basically know the story in 2020 and 2021, where you have this massive infusion, trillions of dollars in aid during the pandemic. That shows up as pretty clear declines in poverty among all of these measures, with the exception of the official poverty measure, the green line there, which is really, if you needed any indication of why the official poverty measure is not a great indicator when you're trying to figure out what's going on with poor folks. You couldn't do better than sort of that standing out. Okay, so then we come to 2022. So 2022, a lot of the pandemic aid that was temporary goes away. We see increases in the SPM, which is the red line. We see increases in a measure. So I have two measures on here that are from a forthcoming paper by our colleague Bruce Meyer with Jim Sullivan and Ji-Hoon Han. Those are shown in the blue line. I can't get the colors here. I think there's like a blue and a yellowish brown. Let's call it brown. I'm sorry. So the blue line is disposable income, and that basically tracks the SPM, which is sort of surprising. It's a much better measure in a lot of ways than the SPM, I would argue. But it essentially goes up in 2022, just like the SPM does. But their other measure is brown, and it's a measure of consumption poverty, and that actually goes down, contrary to all these other measures. So they're finding that consumption poverty is actually lower in 2022. Why might that be? I think they've got a really good story about the pandemic aid, especially in 2021, being essentially more than people needed. Savings rates went through the roof temporarily, and so people held on to some of this assistance that they got. They didn't spend it. 2022 comes and some of the aid goes away, but they have these savings that they can draw down on, and so actually people were better off in 2022, according to his measure as well. Then you get to 2023, and you have a very confusing story, I think. So the OPM goes down, the SPM goes up a bit. However, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has a really interesting report that was out last week, I think, basically arguing that this increase in the SPM poverty is sort of due to the fact that their thresholds are based on 5 years worth of spending, and renters, when you average 5 years of spending, that threshold ends up being kind of artificially high, and so the SPM goes up. But if you account for that and look at what happened at the SPM after accounting for this sort of weirdness, it actually goes down in 2023. So OPM goes down, SPM maybe goes down if you look at it correctly. But the food security supplement, which just came out yesterday, new numbers on food insecurity, that shows food insecurity going up in 2023, not down. If you look at a couple other measures I've got on here, the Federal Reserve Board has a survey called the Survey of Household and Economic Decision Making, I think. And that's shown in there as well in the, I can't see from my angle, one of these lines, purple. So that gets worse over time in terms of the people who are saying that they're doing okay financially. That got worse in 2023 by that measure. So just very hard to figure out what's going on. We don't have consumption poverty measure for 2023. You look ahead to 2024, there are a couple of leading indicators, I think. Evictions, as tracked by Princeton's Eviction Lab, are going down through the first 6 months. If you look at Google searches for payday loan, that's down over the first 6 months versus before. So if you're a layperson trying to make sense of any of this, God bless you. But if you're like one of us up on the stage here trying to make sense of any of it, it's just not clear at all. Probably safest to say, that things didn't change very much one way or another for poverty last year. But how we look versus 2019, are we better than we were in 2019? Are we worse? Not at all clear to me. Maybe others will disagree about it, but.
Yeah, I would just follow up with two points. I think all those numbers are not moving much in 2023 relative to 2022, and so I think a kind of qualitative conclusion that things are pretty similar, seems like a reasonable conclusion. But I wanted to follow up on your point about the SPM threshold because I think that's so important. Any poverty measure compares resources of a given unit to some sort of threshold. And if your resources are above that threshold level, then you're not in poverty. If they're below, then you are. And we had a unusual spike in the price of renting a home, and shelter is an important part of the SPM's threshold measure. But if you actually look at a representative basket of consumer goods and services that includes rental prices, the inflation as measured by that basket went up less than actual expenditures on rent. And so that's the sense in which I think it makes sense to argue that the SPM's threshold went higher than it should have, that it was kind of artificially inflated. When the threshold goes up, it's harder to get your income above the threshold, and so more people end up falling below the threshold, and the poverty rate rises. Like Bradley, I did not have access to the release in advance, and so only had a little bit of time to digest it. But I think that's what's happening with the increase in the SPM. And Scott mentioned that this is a 5-year average threshold, and so that indicates that the SPM threshold is going to be, pretty screwed up for years, which will be a factor in how much weight it's given in policy debates, I think.
All right, well, thank you. So I think we can agree that there's some imperfections in some of the data we received this morning. Brown line's good. Poverty going down. We want that.
Down and down.
And down. So I think we can agree that some imperfections in the data release, but they're still probably the best data we have for 2023 in measuring changes in economic well-being across the distribution. Of course, we're now 2/3 of the way into 2024. People want to know what's happening now. We have more recent data, more updated data on jobless claims and inflation. So sort of taking into account what we've seen in 2024 from some of these other indicators, how do you suspect things are evolving into 2024? Are we continuing to see increases in income, or has that progress stagnated? And what might we be seeing with poverty? For this one, kind of anyone who wants to jump in, feel free to.
Just to kick off, it's a great question, and it's a hard question to kind of begin where Mike left off. Look, census, this is a big report. You go back and look, they're going to apply a more conservative, price adjustment, the CPIU, in one of their blogs, and they can get you to a supplemental poverty rate of about 12%, so down 0.9 percentage points. But nevertheless, I think we're all in here because we, we care about understanding what's happening with the households and the families in America. And these are proxy measures, right? So we do know there's something going on with the household's budget and the household's balance sheet. And we know that for many of these households, rental costs and even mortgage costs have spiked. And so that's putting a lot of serious price pressure. So, on the one hand, inflation obviously appears to be falling. That's a good thing. Income's rising. That's a good thing. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw some tapering off of that rate of increase of earnings growth. That's kind of my current read right now. And I just think that all of us, including folks in the audience, are going to remain sort of attentive to expenses like housing, but also childcare, these sorts of things that actually allow for successful labor market participation and that are also exerting quite a bit of pressure on household budgets. It's going to vary across region, clearly. Like hanging around here in the DMV region, it's going to be a bit different than maybe North Carolina. But maybe the more interesting point is the within-state variation. So Raleigh-Durham is going to have a very different challenge in price versus more rural areas in the Carolinas, right? So those are some of the things I'm kind of keeping my eye on, some of those price pressures that families face, but certainly pleased to see those overall income gains, and maybe a little bit nervous that you'll see some slowdown there. Yeah.
I expect that, based on what we know now, I would expect that real median household income will be higher in March of 2024 than it was in March of 2023. I don't really have intuition about the poverty rate one way or the other. On the one hand, we've seen an increase in unemployment that's going to put downward pressure on earnings among lower earnings households. It's not clear, when rental inflation, when the price of renting an apartment is gonna stop increasing. I think we've been waiting for rental price deflation for about 2 years now, and it never seems to arrive. But even if that the rate of inflation of rents went to zero, as Scott mentioned, we're still kind of stuck with that for the next 5 years, and so it's conceivable to me that that a combination of falling earnings and this kind of quirk in the technical calculation of the SPM threshold could lead to an increase in SPM poverty in 2024 relative to 2023. Also, seems quite conceivable that the opposite could happen. So maybe the right conclusion is 12, 13%, but kind of similar to 2023 to 2022. Not a big change in either direction, but I'm not sure. Maybe others have better intuition on that than I do.
I have a couple thoughts. One is inflation has moderated a bit in 2024. I don't know whether we'll continue to see earnings gains continue to be stronger at the bottom than elsewhere, which is what we did see for a few years since the pandemic. So that would argue, for falling poverty, maybe for rising earnings. On the other hand, there were a few benefits, aspects of the safety net that went away in 2023. May surprise you that the health emergency from the pandemic only ended in May of last year, May of 2023, according to President Biden. And so when that happened, there were some food stamp benefits that went away. There were some school lunch or summer substitute spending for school lunches, since kids aren't in school during the summer. Some of that went away. There were some Medicaid re-enrollment protections that went away. There was an emergency SNAP benefit that basically gave everybody the maximum SNAP amount, and in many cases even more than previously the maximum SNAP amount. That went away in the last 32 states or so, I think in March of 2023. So some of these things did go away, and just like we saw poverty go up in 2022 when some of the pandemic era expansion of the safety net went away, that could push upward on poverty. So unclear to me. I did, as I mentioned, just sort of take a quick look. Eviction rates seem to be down, at least in the 30 cities that Princeton looks at. Google searches for payday loans, which was something that the folks were tracking during the pandemic. It looks like that's down relative to 2023. So I think it remains to be seen.
Anything else?
Well, actually, I'm glad you brought this up about the food assistance. Now, my reading of this, and I'm asking the panel, Scott, my reading was, hey, look, this is part of what's contributing to this OPM, SPM gap. And I don't know how immediately to decompose the pulling back of some of these supports, food assistance, which again, we can translate the food assistance into a cash value. So it's not cash, but it has a cash value for supplemental nutrition assistance and school food assistance. I was reading that as a 2023 thing. So is your take that it's mainly a 2023 thing that we saw, or do you think we'll see some of the consequences, next year if we're back, talking about this? By the way, I don't know the answer. I'm legitimately asking. Yeah.
I mean, arguably, they put downward pressure in 2023 since they were gone by March or whatever. But there were at least 3 months where they were boosting incomes to some extent, unless they were also causing people to work less, right? So that's the other dynamic that we're not talking about, is potentially some of this more generous aid, if it caused people to work less, not obvious what the impact on poverty would have been. So I don't know. I guess I'd be surprised if it makes a big difference in the 2024 numbers.
Mainly a 2023 thing,
Yeah, just because relative to 2022 and 2021, it seems like there was less to go away.
There's a point you made, and it's maybe somewhat tangential, but kind of briefly, this issue of alternative financial instruments, payday loan usage, maybe overdrafting in your checking accounts. This is like a really interesting one. I really like that you brought it up because it's like, how can we think about these alternative data sources to kind of triangulate around what's happening in the economy? And, I don't know that we'll settle on the answer to this question, but I think there's lots of states that have engaged in well-intentioned efforts to ban payday lending. And, if you're concerned about household economic well-being, you are also monitoring this to think about what the potential sources are for households who, for better or worse, whatever your view is, would have approached these sorts of lenders, perhaps of last resort. You don't receive a payday loan typically unless you're able to produce a check stub. And so, you have states who have engaged in this well-intentioned, reform. And I think there's new and emergent work trying to understand maybe some of the consequences, for better or worse, of those sorts of policies. Yeah.
And maybe at this point, we should just kind of broaden the focus to kind of the influence of policies more broadly over the past 8 years. We do have running for president this year, former President Trump, who was president from 2017 through 2020, and we have Vice President Kamala Harris, who's been in the administration the past 4 years. And I tend to think that policies don't always make a huge difference on some of the year-to-year changes that we see in these census numbers, but we have seen pretty large-scale changes in policy, which I think may be changing things over the past 8 years. If you think back to the tax reform, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as of 2017, effective as of 2018, was a really big deal. A lot of regulatory changes during the Trump years. And then starting in 2020 still the Trump years with the CARES Act and some really large fiscal packages, extraordinarily large, that were unprecedented compared to previous times, and delivering checks to people, changing how housing markets work, leading to, at least partially, to some of the increased inflation we've seen. And then even on the local level, there's been increased efforts for, among some states and localities, to relax housing restrictions to allow some more housing to be built, although at the same time, we've seen very high housing prices at the same time, given all the surge in demand during the COVID pandemic. So I guess sort of in light of all of these policy changes over the past 8 years, how do you think that they have influenced not only the data that we see, sort of maybe abstract from some of the data limitations with the supplemental poverty measure, and maybe that median income doesn't adjust for taxes, but it's sort of in terms of driving economic well-being. Are we seeing the results of those policies over the last 8 years in determining what we've seen across the distribution in terms of incomes? And for anyone, feel free to jump in and keep the conversation kind of going. Vanessa, why don't you jump in?
Last point
Sure.
that you made about housing regulations. You and I have talked about sort of some of the reforms that have been happening across the United States, which is fantastic to see. Obviously, we're both super excited, I think, about seeing those reforms, and that state governments have realized that these housing regulations are ultimately counterproductive from a housing supply and housing affordability standpoint. And I think it's safe to say that those housing regulations, they have, impeded the recovery in various ways. One of the ways that they do that is just by preventing workers from matching with sort of their highest opportunity, best possible jobs. And as a result, they limit income growth, because obviously if you have fewer job opportunities and you can't match with the ideal or optimal job, then your income is going to be depressed by that or limited by that over time. So I think those housing regulations, zoning and land use regulations, have certainly gotten in the way over time. And from a housing supply standpoint, of course, limited supply, which further fuels inflation. So they're super problematic. And while it's great that actually these states and local governments, mostly state governments, they have the right incentives at the state level to do something about this, have tried to reform housing and zoning regulations, unfortunately, they have, a lot of the reforms that we're seeing, they're kind of like smaller beans reforms. Yes, there are some more major reforms. The problem with zoning and land use regulations is that they're so pervasive in American cities that even if you make a single reform, there's still hundreds of other regulations that can basically undo that reform that you made. You can simply restrict housing in a different way with a different lever and basically totally undo whatever reform you made, whether that's, minimum lot size or single family zoning versus multifamily zoning, or whether it's parking regulations or something else altogether, height restrictions. There's just so many levers for restricting housing supply. And so I guess what I would say on that front is that we need to see much more continued reforms and really a comprehensive overhaul across the board in American cities. And I'm not sure that state governments are totally ready to do that yet, but hopefully we'll continue to see progress.
Or ready at all.
Or ever, yes. I hope that they will be, but with time.
I mean, I could take the easy low-hanging fruit answer, which is, without the federal government's response to the pandemic, we would have had a plunge in median income and a huge spike in poverty, I think, as measured by any of these measures. It's hard, I think, to overstate the scale of the economic challenge that the United States faced in really March and April of 2020. There was a combination of the onset of the pandemic and the onset of restrictions on business activity and on broader economic activity. The measured unemployment rate went above 15%. A more kind of correct measure of the unemployment rate, surely was above 20%. By way of comparison, we had about a 25% unemployment rate during the Great Depression, and so this was really a massive problem, and Congress and the administration responded with a swiftness. I think the CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th, and my recollection is that kind of like the last normal day, at least here in Washington, was March 13th. So that's 14-day response time. Congress responded with really imaginative policies. I mean, things that I would have told you in February of 2020 we could never do. The Paycheck Protection Program, I would have said that was way too complicated for Congress to hammer out in just a few days. Writing checks to households, I would have said that you could never get that through Congress. And just the size. The CARES Act was around $2 trillion. President Obama, couldn't get half that in 2009, following the 2008 financial crisis, and that, I think, made an enormous difference. And these graphs would look a lot different without that.
Yeah, I mean, I just appreciate Mike's framing here. And, whether you're a policy advocate, student, analyst of policy, there's no doubt that the salience of the problem we faced really helped to get attention to try to solve a problem. And there were imperfections in implementation, and policy implementation is its own important lane to really stay focused on. And so there's an opportunity for reflection. What were we able to do effectively? What might we do differently and tweak? But, specifically with a lot of my own work, I've focused on the economic conditions facing children in the U.S. And so, kids don't choose. They don't choose their neighborhood. They don't choose their parents. And so ultimately, when you've seen historic poverty rates, and to be clear, when I'm listing off stylized facts like, Black child poverty rates hovering historically maybe between a quarter to a third of the group, it obscures the fact that the largest group on the levels in poverty have been and continue to be white Americans. And so it's a multiracial, multi-ethnic challenge that affects the country in terms of region. I studied at Kentucky, and a lot of the work that I was doing brought me into closer understanding of the poverty issues facing Appalachia. So, with that said, during the pandemic years, economic impact payments, expanded child tax credits, it can't be overemphasized that, on the data, we reduced child poverty to historic lows. And so it was a 1-year thing. Those rates jumped back up the following year. I think there's credible evidence that these sorts of poverty reductions could have long-term economic returns for the country. Now, you might just think that's the right thing to do. You might think there's other ways to do it. But when I think about the past several years, I do think about kind of the rolling back of a lot of these supports, some of which make quite a bit of sense because we're no longer in the same type of pandemic. I do have on my Kaiser Permanente app that I'm due for my COVID jab in a few weeks here. So still have to be cautious, but nevertheless, we're in a different time period now. So, I think that there was a lot of promising interventions that we were able to see. I would just kind of echo Vanessa. I appreciate the point about housing, because again, household budget, household's balance sheet, this is the biggest bite, and especially when you look at lower ends of the earning distribution. And I just think that there's room and opportunity for sort of our own Sputnik or just very ambitious national level intervention to think big about this component of the market. And I'm not making a commitment to what that looks like, but there have been times in our nation's history, I'm thinking post-World War II, where we tried to think big about housing. And this might be the kind of challenge that individual jurisdictions can use some help with, right? And so, I'm glad that you brought it up. I'm not here to turn this into a housing panel, and that's not my lane necessarily, but it's such a big component when you think about, food, clothing, shelter, utilities. So, yeah.
Just very quickly to add on to Mike's point, I would sign on to everything that he said about 2020. I think the addendum is that 2021 was a big mistake and a missed opportunity in a lot of ways. I think we did get poverty rates down to historic lows temporarily, mainly through policies that would have been a pretty bad idea, I think, if they'd been permanent and longer term. And I think maybe most importantly, we started thinking too much about getting the poverty rate as low as we possibly could and too little about other things. If you ask me today, do we try to get the poverty rate back down to where it was in 2021, or do we fix the school absentee problem for kids? What's going to be better in the long run for kids? Not a tough call for me. I think the learning loss and the student absentee problems that we've had, I think is basically a casualty of our having focused too much on redistribution for a couple of years.
Which disproportionately affects low-income kids, and which will lower their lifetime incomes and lead to worse labor market outcomes for them. If a high-income kid missed a year of school, their parents will hire a tutor or something, but that's not in the cards for a lot of low-income Americans, unfortunately. So I think that's a crucial issue, and really a crucial issue if you're specifically concerned about mobility out of poverty, or poverty among kids.
Thanks. Well, today we have 2 events today. This event here, which is probably the most important one. There's another event tonight, a presidential debate between Vice President Harris and former President Trump.
This will be more substance.
Each side has laid out some
I feel good about it.
some economic policy positions and different levels of detail. But from what you can glean from what we've heard from our 2 presidential candidates, how do you foresee any of those policies really making a difference several years down the line when we're looking at income and poverty changes at that point? And again, we'll go out of order, so as soon as you have something, feel free to jump in.
I think I would build on Scott's answer to your last question, Kevin. It's interesting that there seems to be agreement. At least, I think it's unusually hard to know where the candidates at the top of each ticket stand on policy issues, but it seems like Vice President Harris and Senator Vance, at least, agree on an expansion of the child tax credit that would include a large increase in the refundability of the credit that would go to households with no labor market earnings. And this, of course, relates to the historic drop in child poverty for that year that Bradley mentioned. When I think about that drop, I think that drop is an invitation to reflect on what we mean when we talk about poverty. And Bradley referred to all these measures on Scott's chart as proxy measures, and what are they proxying for? I'm inclined to argue that if your definition of poverty is fragile to the point that an extra $2,000 means you're not in poverty, but if you take that away, then you're back in poverty. That is not a durable enough conception of poverty, and that what you really want to know, I think, is harder to define. But when I think about that question, I really want to know, is this household largely self-sufficient? And you give a household $2,000 one year, and you take it away the next. You're not affecting that household's ability to be self-sufficient. Now, Bradley mentioned evidence that suggests that if you give that household an extra $2,000 a year over a 15-year period, maybe you build up the capacity for self-sufficiency, and that I think is a reasonable argument, but a debatable argument. And I think the debate over the child credit, I don't think you're going to hear this tonight, but I think the debate over whether or not to expand the child credit and the debate over whether or not to expand it in a way that really increases the generosity for households without a working parent, it would be better focused on that than on what I think the media and a large number of analysts, to be fair, focused on with the expiration of the American Rescue Plan's credit, which was just what does it do to that chart? I think what it does to that chart is of secondary importance.
I'll just jump in and say, I found the research that you've done, Kevin, on the child tax credits expansion under the American Rescue Plan to be quite persuasive and compelling. And obviously that research finds that it reduces work, that parents drop out of the labor force, and that's something that we probably don't want to see if we care about long-term outcomes and long-term consequences for families. If we go back to the 90s welfare reform, as you've pointed out before, one of the things that we liked about that reform is actually that it meant that single mothers were more engaged in the workforce, and that translated into economic opportunities for their kids over time. So, I think it is interesting that as Michael pointed out, that the two parties have converged on a variety of different policy proposals. One is the child tax credit expansion, which I think the way that both parties have suggested they would do that, I actually think would be problematic and have some of these negative long-term consequences that we should worry about. And then there have been actually ideas, on the other hand, which have been positive that both parties have agreed on. So rather than just focus on the negative, which I do have a list of things that I could go through if we have time, you know, they both have suggested that they are in favor of federal lands reform, which would be going back to the housing element, which would be helpful from a housing affordability perspective. Obviously, all of the proposals, so-called proposals that both candidates have suggested that they are in favor of to this point have been quite light on detail, so it's really hard to know exactly how much that would actually help housing affordability. You know, like the federal lands reform is just like a single line in a press release that the Harris-Walz campaign put out a couple weeks ago. So it's hard to know exactly how much that would help, but theoretically it could help if it was undertaken and if the reforms that were made were, you know, major and substantial reforms rather than small, middling reforms.
Bradley, go ahead.
Yeah, so, you know, I would just jump in and say that it is really fascinating to see that, you know, both candidates are zeroing in again on a lot of the issues facing middle class, working class Americans. And to be clear, their plight and their challenges are very much related to the challenges of folks who are exposed to poverty spells because income and earnings are dynamic. So part of what makes our economy the best in the world is that you have all sort of creative destruction. You have businesses that start and fail. You have the nimbleness of firms to be able to hire and reduce and increase hours. That does then mean that many of our families and workers face some earnings volatility. They face some fluctuations. And so we sort of expect this. And with that as a backdrop, you know, how do you think about investments in children who are going to be hopefully more productive, healthier, less prone to having contact with the criminal justice system? And I don't think that cash transfers are the answer, but I think they can be part of the answer. And so, like, you know, you can think about this as a full 360 in terms of investments. It's just fascinating to see that you have both sides of this coalescing around some sort of child benefit. And I think it's just worth noting that, look, you got other countries like Canada, South Korea that have implemented this with great success to reduce child poverty. And, you know, I guess the other piece that I would bring up is that right now, based on that 1 year's worth of data, my reading is that we feel pretty confident that there was some improvement in economic well-being, okay? So, and I would say there was a reduction in poverty, a historic reduction in poverty. But we don't see conclusive evidence that there were big impacts on work in that 1 year. It doesn't mean you wouldn't see it if we made this permanent. I don't think we know, and we'd have to monitor that. But with all these policy reforms, you're trying to think about cost and benefits. And you know, my reading of this is that the benefits to these households are exceedingly positive. With all of this stuff, you're talking about a summary measure. You know, case in point, super disturbing story last night, and it kind of overlaps poverty and housing. In our metro area, District of Columbia, filing a lawsuit against landlords who are sort of promoting substandard conditions. And you know, the video graphic evidence is just incredibly disturbing. We're talking feces, mice, rats, mold. And when I think about that context for kids, I'm not making a statement on the share of our metro area exposed to it, but how does that then overlap with that kid being more or less present in school? And, you know, one of my former colleagues, Seth Gershenson, done some of the cutting edge work on school absences, so I believe it matters. But then with all these things, we start to peel that onion back to figure out, okay, what's causing this? What's going on behind the scenes? So, you know, I'm happy to see both sides trying to focus on kids as an investment. And, you know, right now, I view what we were able to do in 2021 as overall really positive. And absolutely, you want to think about implementation. You want to think about issues of targeting. But I think there's a lot to potentially build off of. I'll stop there. Yeah.
I think what's most troublesome to me is that there seems to be a convergence by both parties on the view that the economy is terrible, and therefore what we need to do is rein in markets and give people cash. And so if it's not a child allowance or UBI, it's $25,000 towards a down payment on a home, which is not going to do anything for housing affordability. Or it's canceling student loan debt.
If you're going to sell a home, that'll be good for you.
Sure. Yes, that's right.
Or if you're a realtor.
That's right. Home values go up. Good to be a homeowner. Not so good if you're trying to break into the home market. Canceling student loan debt. That's going to help a lot of grad students who got PhDs in English without really thinking it through. It certainly will help some disadvantaged kids as well, but disproportionately it's going to benefit people who, should be paying off the loan that they contracted to be responsible for. Rent control, sort of another thing that's been floated during the campaign season, which is just crazy. So you have this view that, everything's terrible. To be clear, 2019, was a historic low for poverty. So whatever one of those lines is right for 2023, we're doing pretty good on poverty. We're doing really good on child poverty versus historical patterns. What we're not doing well on is upward mobility for poor kids. That doesn't seem to have improved much over time at all. There's giant racial gaps. Given that we've reduced poverty quite a bit, it seems like giving people cash is not going to be the way that you increase upward mobility, and it's going to call for different kinds of solutions. And neither party really seems to be that focused on it or that thinking that creatively about it. I think that's the most discouraging thing.
Anything else on the presidential campaigns? Yes, Bradley and then Vanessa.
Sure.
And Mike, yeah, let's stay on it.
It's like, well, okay, how are we doing on time here, by the way?
I have one important question, but if we have 2 minutes for it, that's okay.
Yeah.
I just want to ask it rather than have any answers to it.
So, I think what I would just say is that, even right now, a couple blocks down the street, I'm teaching the supply-demand model to talk about why price controls can cause all sorts of problems within the market. And so, what I would just say here is that there's a lot that we don't know about how these sorts of things are going to be actually implemented. And on the books throughout many states, many including those that are in the path of hurricanes and tropical storms, you're going to see anti-price gouging laws. When and in what ways are they triggered? That tends to be the more interesting question, I think. And so, what I would say there is I certainly see a lot of quantitative and qualitative evidence that households are very concerned about the expenses that they see with respect to rent, with respect to groceries. Certainly, I think folks on this panel, me included, see the role for aggressive supply side interventions on things like housing, for example. We think about supply chain and global disruptions as ways to kind of reduce costs for households. But when we talk about the price controls, I just remind folks, we have them here. Even right now, those of us in this room with market income, if there's a price fluctuation or irregularity that occurs, we can literally turn trading off, okay? So, I think it doesn't mean that we like it, but I do think that if we're being candid about it, we do have some of these controls throughout our economy. I think the interesting question is how and in what ways would folks potentially implement this? And I don't know the answer to that.
Did you want to jump in, Vanessa?
Oh man, that took us in a totally different direction than what I was planning. Maybe the economist would like to weigh in later on his feelings on price controls. My understanding, and no disrespect at all, Bradley, is just that some of these proposals, like the price gouging proposal and rent control, pretty roundly criticized. And there's, I know certainly I'm more familiar with the academic literature on rent control, and certainly I think there's a lot of support for the idea that rent control exacerbates creates housing shortages and underinvestment, and I think the same mechanism would probably be applicable when it comes to grocery store prices and food. But that was not what I actually wanted to chip in here and say. What I was actually hoping to just insert into the conversation, Scott had mentioned a couple of things, the housing subsidy for first-time homeowners. And I just wanted to mention that this is definitely an equal opportunity situation where there are bad ideas coming from both sides. And one of the ideas that most recently came from the Trump and Vance side of the equation is the idea of IVF subsidies. And I think that as we're talking about poverty and income numbers here, specifically, an IVF subsidy would be something that would really be captured by higher income, highly educated women, typically, on average, if fertility behaviors were to continue to hold and sort of stay stable. Obviously, it would create new incentives, so that might shift around a little bit, but certainly when you look at fertility behavior today, and you were to impose a policy like that at the federal level, it looks like it would be largely captured by highly educated women. And so I think, as we're thinking about poverty, we want to be really careful not to create new and regressive subsidies. Keep focused on that lower income part of the distribution.
Mike, IVF, price gouging, something else to you.
Bradley's comments on the price gouging proposal just made me think about how vague how vague all of these discussions have been. A federal price gouging law, kind of along the lines of what many states have, I think would be bad but pretty harmless. A federal price control law along the lines of what Elizabeth Warren has proposed, I think would be a disaster of substantial proportions. And the Harris campaign has, at different times, indicated that the proposal is similar to the Warren proposal, that it is not similar to the Warren proposal, that it is just a kind of run-of-the-mill, plain vanilla price gouging proposal, that it is not that. Similar, obviously, with President Trump, who has kind of been all over the map on his proposals in a few different policy areas, and so maybe a public service that could be offered by the debate moderator this evening would be to attempt to extract some specificity on a few of these. That way, analysts can render more decisive conclusions about their desirability.
Yeah, I do think one of the challenges that economists face is that many of our models, and I find myself in this trap sometimes, render conclusions based on some medium or long term. And so, politicians and elected officials are operating in a very short time space, and they're interacting with folks on a daily and weekly basis. And so, trying to bring those policy prescriptions, sort of into focus with those time horizons in mind. There's lots of things that we talk about that I think have broad economic benefits that we can measure. And then for individual households, they might see it as a net negative. So that's always a challenge. Yeah.
All right, we have questions coming. So we have 1 minute left for my question. I think I'm basically just going to ask it and answer it myself. So the Census Bureau today released data for 2023, and the media is mostly going to focus on what's happened in the past year from 2022 to 2023. That said, the more important news is really about long-term trends in economic well-being. And sort of when you look at poverty over decades or income growth across the distribution, I think it's important to highlight what we see, which is that when you measure poverty correctly when you include all transfers, you hold inflation or thresholds constant only with inflation. When you look at inflation-adjusted income but include all transfers and adjust for taxes, you do see dramatic declines in poverty and increases in income across the distribution. If anyone wants to substantially disagree with that, I'll allow it. Otherwise, I will move to questions. Scott, do you want to disagree with that?
I'll squeeze in
Okay.
a point that I wanted to make before about long-term trends. So the Census Bureau has started using a much better measure of inflation for its income numbers, but only going back to 2000. And so before 2000, you've got the same bad inflation figures that a bunch of us have criticized before, and that overstate inflation, and so it understates progress over time. So for instance, the numbers that are in the new report show for household income, median household income, it rose by 35% from 1969 to 2023. If we could extend the good inflation measure all the way back, that 35% increase would go to a 49% increase. And we don't use it at all for the official poverty measure. So we're sort of overstating every year by a little bit more how many people are in poverty.
Okay, great. It seems like we have a lot of demand for questions, so I am going to move to that stage. I will note you have to first say what your name is, and then second, you have to ask a question. And if you start to ramble on about random stuff, I will stop you. Okay, so Tim has the microphone.
We've got a good online question from Ben.
Oh, online questions.
yeah.
Okay, so we'll
We
do
get
one
to that
online
first.
question, then we'll go to the in-person
Yeah.
audience.
So he's wondering if the panel can dive a little bit deeper into explaining why the OPM went down and the SPM went up in 2023. And is it specifically due to what Dr. Hardy was mentioning about COVID aid ending in 2022, or is it more due to the 5-year spending threshold changes that Scott mentioned?
OPM went down because income went up, and SPM went up because rent prices are overrepresented in the threshold, and the threshold went up by more than income went up.
All right, let's move on to the
Look at that.
in-person questions. Let's start over here on the left, on this gentleman right in the front, and name and then question.
JP Hogan. Though I am curious about the poverty, if it's new poverty or people return to poverty, it's more of the income. You talked about incomes went up earlier. I'm just wondering, with Bidenomics, with so much everything costs more, where were the wage increases coming from? Can it be that they were coming from higher profits, or were companies making adjustments to keep wages a living standard?
Companies were in a desperate scramble to find workers, and nominal wages were growing rapidly because of those supply and demand dynamics. I think what you see over the last few years as a whole is that the same underlying economic demand that led businesses to need workers also pushed up prices. And for the first 2 years of the Biden administration, prices were growing faster than wages, and then for the last year, wages were growing faster than prices, which is reflected in this report.
All right, great. Let's move up into the back, and then we'll come up to the front next.
Thank you. Bonnie Wachtel. I'll address this to Michael Strain. The data you and the moderator both referred to data that is tax and transfer affected. And the work that Phil Graham and others did specifically on that basis, as you know, found that approximately the bottom 60% of Americans had the same disposable income consumption based whether they were working or not. That was a very arresting and compelling finding. Could you explain how what we're talking about today, not so much the year-to-year compares, but just generally, this data fits into the Graham-led study?
I think there are many different ways to measure income, and if you choose kind of the most holistic way possible and you assign a dollar value to Medicaid benefits and a dollar value to Medicare benefits and measure income in that way, then you're obviously going to find higher incomes than if you adopt a more narrow definition of income, higher incomes among the bottom half of the population. It is I think notable, at least the last time I looked, that the median income household based on market income gets more from the government than it gives, and that's something that can be debated in a political context. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of kind of objective economic content to that. I think a more holistic measure when measuring poverty is desirable, at least when measuring poverty as a way to evaluate safety net programs' effectiveness. It is kind of on its face uncompelling to argue that all these safety net programs aren't reducing poverty when you don't include the program benefits in your poverty measure. But wanting to know, I think, what a poverty rate would be when only using what individuals are actually earning, I think is also a sensible thing to want to look at. So I tend to be more, as this answer demonstrates, I tend to be more agnostic, about the specific measure, and I would kind of prefer to see a whole bunch of them when trying to come up with a holistic assessment of either income or poverty.
I do think the Graham elderly numbers are probably a little too striking, in the sense that they're not just valuing Medicaid as income; they're valuing kind of upward bound programs in the summer as income. They're sort of counting administrative costs in a lot of cases to run programs as income that gets received by low-income people. So I think the truth is somewhere between that, I think, and sort of more conventional analyses that you tend to see.
Great. Next question, right in the front here, then we'll keep moving that way.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. We have this disconnect we always talk about between economic data and surveys of how Americans really feel. If we look at that 4-year question, which might come up tonight, I just did a back of the envelope calculation based on the new figure, and it looks to me like inflation is just outpacing the gains in median household income over the last 4 years. Anybody can check me on that, but I think it's just barely ahead. No wonder people feel like they're running in place. But here's my real question. We also are looking at several other surveys which show the number of Americans, 68% by one survey, are either already have a second gig to their regular job or are looking for one. At least by some measures, 44% already are working a second gig. Some households, 4 or 5 jobs of sorts, part-time, whatever they might be. So we've got an overworked middle class. How does that figure in any of your calculations for what's really going in if we're calling this the economic well-being?
I mean, look, I think if President Trump were smart, he would say that the Census Bureau put out data today that showed that inflation-adjusted household income for the median household is lower in 2023 than it was in 2019, and that's a factually accurate statement. And I think, kind of given that, it's no surprise that a lot of Americans feel pretty crummy about the economy. It's hard to. I think the sentiment that people have, to some degree, depends on the way the question is asked. So, if you ask people, how are you feeling about the economy? A lot of people are feeling really bad about the economy because everything is 20% more expensive than it was 3.5 years ago, and they have a sense that their purchasing power, the purchasing power of their income is kind of, treaded water or maybe even declined, depending on the household. If you were to ask, are how do you feel about the economy today relative to a year ago, then you'd probably get answers that were much more positive. But a big lesson for both economists and I think for elected officials of the last few years is that people really, 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 really hate inflation. And when you have inflation that's been kind of as aggressive as we've experienced, then even when the inflation abates, you're left with really high prices relative to your recent memory, and that's people will not be mad about that forever, right? I'm old enough to remember buying a can of soda with a quarter, and now it costs like $3, and I'm not mad that it doesn't cost a quarter, but I am mad that it costs $3. And 20 years from now, I won't still be mad about that, but we'll see how long my anger lasts.
I think depending on where you lie within the economic distribution, you don't like the $3 or $5 cup of coffee, but if your earnings have outpaced that price growth, then it's no big deal. It's no big deal. You might bellyache about it a little bit, but privately, if you're experiencing those income gains, then you're better off, and you're still going on the vacations you like, consuming the way you want to consume. I think this kind of relates to a broader stylized fact that Kevin brought up, though, which is that market income work is going to be such an important component of lifting economic outcomes, and so you're not doing it without work participation. But historically in the data, we're seeing that the big poverty gains, the big reductions that we see are really work packaged with the government support since the late 60s. And when you look at it together, we've made great gains, okay? In general, on average, if you're just stripping out those programs, then our progress looks a little bit more mixed. But certainly in a town like Washington, D.C., with many talented young people, with post-college credentials, for example, I think things in America haven't been better, right? And so that's the complexity of, I think, what we're talking about here, and thinking hard about conditions for many of our neighbors who might not have the same formal educational credentials, and what are the opportunities if we think there's shortages in some of the trades that are going to pay a really high wage. I'm thinking about the building I live in. If the elevator goes out or the garage door breaks, we're calling somebody in, oftentimes from West Virginia. We pay them very well. To my knowledge, these folks don't hold a college credential, but there's opportunities for folks to move up the economic ladder. And so how can we put people in those positions to do better? So yeah, I think there's a lot of complexity to it. There's a lot to like about our economy, and I think we're all here to try to think about how we can make it work even better. Yeah.
Income gains were shared across the income distribution, actually, in the 2023 numbers that were just released. So I think that's positive. Maybe we're turning a corner a little bit here. I don't think we saw a chart on that earlier. I don't know, I'm forgetting, but I think they're broadly shared. So that's positive. And to your point about working multiple jobs, there might be something going on there, which is just related to how much engagement there is in the gig economy now. It is actually easier to hold multiple jobs than it used to be. Not to say that people aren't working super hard. They are, of course, and juggling multiple, roles, doing different things is definitely can be logistically challenging, but it might not be exactly the same holding down multiple jobs that it was 20 years ago or something, when gig opportunities weren't available to folks.
Just a big report on hours worked over 130 years or something. And the average worker today doesn't work any more hours than they did at the end of World War II. What's that? About the same, but unemployment's very low. So I think it's really easy to, I think, turn towards the negative perceptions things. If you're running for president, like, the perception is the reality, right? But I do think it's important to separate perception from the facts. About prices and wages, going back to your question, a wage is a price. So, inflation means prices went up, but also means like wages are one of those prices that also went up. And so I think there's a tendency to sort of see, that the things you buy at the grocery store cost more, but to not necessarily recognize that, oh yeah, I actually got a 4% raise last year myself because of inflation. So I think it's just very careful to distinguish between perceptions, which are important for Vice President Harris and Donald Trump, and reality on the other hand.
All right, well, that puts us at time. I apologize for the questions we didn't get to. Thank you all for attending today, and thank you so much for our panelists for joining us.